We're now going to talk a little bit about feminism. And feminism, really came to the forefront in the 60s and 70s as an identity-based movement, obviously based on gender. And feminism has had an interesting run ever since. Originally, it sort of started out as a more biological examination of gender. Mostly now, however, we look at it as gender as a construction. So it has gone through some different iterations of what feminism means. Judy Chicago, this artist that you're looking at here, for instance, looked at more the idea of feminism as a biological construct. And so a lot of her works, like Dinner Party, for instance, deal with the vagina, right, as the ultimate symbol of the female. So when you're looking at the Dinner Party here, she made it as this room size installation where she created dinner plates and in place settings, right, for these, as she put it, important historical women and important mythological women. And all the plates, in a sense, look like vaginas. And so she takes this sort of idea of biological imperative and applies it to the object. This is something that I don't think a more contemporary feminist would do today, but at this time it was sort of like body beautiful, power from biology, et cetera, and so forth. So again, this piece is very, very famous for kind of creating a roster of women who could be looked at as very important figures. You'll notice that all the plates are kind of themed to who the woman was. Theodora, for instance, was, you might remember her as the Byzantine empress we discussed with Justinian. So the plate kind of looks like a mosaic. So this idea of using the look of something, right, to inform it. When you look at sort of later day feminism, this is feminism from the 1980s, you start to see it much more about gender as a construction, or feminism as somewhat of a guerrilla act. Hence, we look at the Guerrilla Girls here. Notice the gorilla is spelled like guerrilla action, but they wear gorilla like the animal mask. This is a very interesting group. In the 1980s, women artists in New York started to think about why they weren't getting paid as much or why they weren't getting as many gallery shows as male artists. And rather than sort of speak out as themselves, they decided to come together as a collective group, wear the mask to hide their identity, and do these different kinds of disruptive activities, as they put it. A lot of what they did was flyers, sort of putting flyers out in neighborhoods, putting them out at shows, and, just the absurdity of walking around with these gorilla masks on. And they actually never let anyone know who they are. So people don't know who the Guerrilla Girls are. So it's about this idea of using the anonymity to advance your agenda, in a sense, to not let your own personality, in a sense, distract, right, from what you're trying to say. So they were actually trying to not use the cult of personality. Hello, that's my cat. So they were trying not to use the cult of personality. They actually were trying to sort of erase their idea of identity. Here are some of their flyers, and you'll notice they focus on not just even today sort of gender ideology, but also issues that relate to minority groups and other type of groups that have had discrimination sort of lobbied against them. So they do more than just sort of feminist issues. But there's some good examples of feminist artists. Here's another of their flyers as well. Notice they try to use kind of tongue-in-cheek humor to address serious matters. Another one also, the idea of tokenism and how to address tokenism, and why this matters, we're only concerned about Black history during February. Why are we not concerned about it the rest of the year? So they're trying to draw attention to why it can be hard to get exposure as a minority, exposure as a woman, so forth. Also wanted to talk to you a little bit about performance art, one of my favorites. And I always think this is when you think about, like, how do you turn your own body into an artistic vessel, leaving the canvas behind or the sculptor's chisel behind and using your body itself. It really often is about putting yourself into uncomfortable spaces, maybe unsafe spaces, in order to prove a point. Chris Burden is very famous for doing this. He literally has a, reputation for these unsafe acts. And this is his piece Shoot, which is just what it sounds like, where he literally had a friend shoot him, think of all the things that can go wrong and so forth. So it's about sort of like putting your body in this untenable situation. This is a later piece he did called Through the Night Softly, where you have him crawling pretty much nude right through broken glass. Thinking about the body as something to push, right? To push to these extremes is what a lot of performance artists do. Another of his pieces, Transfixed, where he was nailed to a VW bug. Obvious crucifixion references are intended as well. This is Yoko Ono. She's very famous for performance art. You might also know her as, the Beetle Breaker Upper, but that's a whole other separate issue. But Ono is very well known for creating these experiential kind of pieces like Cut Piece. Cut Piece is probably one of my favorite pieces of art, if I had to sort of pick a top 10. And the reason why is it's unexpected. What she did was come in to a theater with an audience, and she knelt down like you see her in the photos. She had an announcer, and she put a pair of scissors next to her. And she had an announcer come in and say, Yoko Ono invites you to cut off her clothes. And then the announcer left. And one has to think about what happens in the space of that declaration and her sitting there Zen-like. She did grow up in Asia, so she's very informed by Zen practice, Buddhist practice. But what happens when someone tells you that they want you to cut off their clothes? Do we jump right up to do this? No, we don't. So she said the piece was really about not her, but the audience, like what the audience was going to do in response to her directive. She said that, the idea of our uncomfortability, our incredulity, like this can't be happening. Then someone finally does it. And then what happens from there? Everyone wants to do it. And the violence that might come from this. She said, these are all things about, the human condition.